I'd like to say welcome to everyone who's here today. We'll be talking about dealing with A zones. And I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager. I'll be one of the presenters. And Doug, if you could introduce yourself.
Yep, I'm Doug Joachim. I'm a floodplain engineer here at the DNR. I've been here a little under 2 years, but I do a lot of floodplain mapping and modeling, help with letters of map revision review.
Great, thanks, Doug. And we do have a few of our other coworkers. Gary Bennett and Ricky Hoffman will be helping watch the chat and some of the logistics. And Jeff Weiss is also here in case questions come up. And I'm going to turn it over to Doug to start the actual presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Ceil. All right, fantastic. Yeah, so I'm just going to walk through the topics that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what A zones are, provide some terms and definitions and a regulatory overview. We'll talk about map updates in the state of Minnesota. We'll go over what data is available, where you can find it, as well as what data is in the pipeline and when that might become available. We'll go through administering A zones. We'll talk about finding base flood elevations or BFEs in A zones. And then we'll also talk about determining floodway versus flood fringe for A zones. So to start, what are A zones? What is a floodway and what is a flood fringe? So there are several different types of floodplain delineations that you may come across. The most common are going to be your Zone AE or Zone A floodplain delineations. So a Zone AE, which is not the focus of this presentation, that is a detailed engineering analysis. There will be official base flood elevations shown on maps, and there will be profiles and floodway data tables in a flood insurance study. Zone A's, on the other hand, are approximate delineations. So those do not include official BFEs on the map, and they won't have profiles or data tables in the report. You may occasionally come across Zone D and Zone VE. They're less common in Minnesota, and then there are some other older floodplain types that you may come across as well. So a Zone A, as I mentioned, is an approximate study. What that means is that there's often little or no fieldwork conducted during this delineation process. Older flood insurance rate maps or firms often use existing data such as flood hazard boundary maps or flood-prone quadrangle maps. However, new digital firms or D firms do have models or other supporting documentation available that can be used to estimate the base flood elevation or BFE. And I'll also note here that the base flood elevation is equivalent to the 100-year or the 1% annual exceedance probability flood elevation. Where there is no existing data available, there are appropriate methods for approximating floodplain boundaries that should be selected and applied. So this is a map showing Minnesota, and it's showing all of our FEMA mapped floodplains, either in blue or red. The red lines represent where we have an AE zone or a detailed study. Those tend to be concentrated on major waterways or in highly developed urbanized areas. The blue lines, which cover the majority of the state, those are your approximate A zone studies. So in rural areas and really across most of the state, you're more likely to come across an A zone. This is showing two older Zone A maps. So on the right, we have the oldest. This is kind of a dot matrix plot showing the floodplain in relation to really roadways primarily. There's not a whole lot of other information shown. On the left, we have a slightly more recent map. It shows a more detailed delineation. There are some kind of black dots representing major structures. But again, not a lot of information. And so the main thing that both of these maps are lacking is an aerial photograph. So newer FEMA maps do include that aerial photograph. So we've got our Zone A floodplain shaded in blue, and we can see where the edge of the floodplain is relative to structures and other areas of interest. One other advantage of these newer maps is they are mapped using newer LiDAR. So the floodplain boundary is a lot more accurate in these newer maps. In contrast, we also wanted to show you what a detailed or Zone AE floodplain may look like. So we do still have the aerial photograph, which is very helpful for locating structures. We do still have our blue shaded area representing that 1% floodplain, but there are a few additional bits of information here. So we do have a delineated floodway, which we'll talk about what a floodway is in a moment, but that's this kind of red hatched area here, kind of going through that floodplain. We also show in this kind of orangish area areas of medium flood risk. So that's going to be the 500-year or 0.2% chance annual flood. So that is something that will be shown on an AE zone map that would not be on an A zone map. And then these areas that are not shaded on both of the maps, those are the lower flood risk areas that are above the delineated floodplain elevation. Okay, so what is a floodway? This graphic here is showing a floodplain kind of spanning this river valley here. This shaded blue area in the center is the floodway. So the floodway is the area that will have the deepest water that's traveling the fastest during a flood event. That will always contain the actual river channel itself, as well as adjacent areas that are a little bit lower elevation. And then on the sides here, we have what's known as the flood fringe. And those are areas where the water will be more shallow, traveling a lot more slowly. You can kind of think of it as the floodway being the main conveyance for the floodplain, whereas the flood fringe is acting more as storage. So this is showing the same thing, just in cross-sectional form. We've got our 100-year floodplain with the thicker arrows here. In the center, we've got our floodway. So this is where the water is deepest and flowing the fastest. It does include the actual stream. And then the flood fringe is here on the sides where the water is more shallow, traveling more slowly. Oftentimes there's structures or trees and things on the flood fringe that also slows the water down. So this is primarily storage in the fringe and conveyance in the floodway. So when we model a floodway, we try to simulate the flood fringe being completely filled in. So as you might expect, when you start filling in a floodplain, the areas that don't have fill are going to see a rise in water elevation because we've got the same amount of flow traveling through a smaller cross-sectional area. It needs to rise to convey that much flow. That rise is what's known as a surcharge. Typically, you would continue filling in the flood fringe until you reach a maximum surcharge of 1/2 foot, and what's left is known as the floodway. There are many cases where the floodway surcharge will be less than 1/2 foot, but that is the maximum allowable surcharge in Minnesota. And there is one important caveat to that the 1/2 foot rise is allowed only if there is no increase in flood damage potential, which you can think of that as no buildings being impacted. So buildings that are not currently in the floodplain can't suddenly become in the floodplain due to a surcharge, and buildings that are already in the floodplain can't experience a rise associated with that.
I just wanted to interject that FYI, the national standard allows 1 foot of rise, so Minnesota is more restrictive.
Yeah, thanks, Ceil. Yeah, so this is just showing an excerpt from a flood insurance study. So most of the counties in Minnesota do have flood insurance studies available. There are a few who do not. And flood insurance studies are a great resource for determining how these floodplains were developed. You can look at the methodology associated with that. And there's also great tabular data showing you elevations at many cross sections on major waterways, including a floodway data table that shows you the elevation both with and without that floodway accounted for. This is showing roughly the same thing, but a newer version of it. So in recent years, they have updated what that cover page looks like. The formatting is slightly different, but the same great information is available there. Okay, so now we'll move into administering A zones. So why do I need flood elevations and floodways? So in a general floodplain, so say an A zone or an AE zone that doesn't have a floodway, it's important to note that no new structures can be constructed unless the area is shown to be flood fringe. So even though there isn't a floodway in an A zone, we regulate them as though there is. And similarly, there's any development of any kind, so not structures, but grading, culverts and bridges, etc. Those must show that they meet an allowable rise. So again, that's that no more than 1/2 foot rise and no impact to existing structures. This is an excerpt from the Minnesota Floodplain Management Quick Guide. There is a link here in the PDF, so when we send out the slides, you can get to it there. Otherwise, just go ahead and Google for that. This is going to give a lot more detail than what we will be providing today. So I won't walk through this, but just know that it exists and it is a great resource. Okay, so in Minnesota, we do have what's known as a regulatory flood protection elevation, or RFPE, which you can think of as the minimum lowest floor elevation for a new structure. And there's a little calculation you can perform to come up with that RFPE. So you can start by taking the 1% annual chance BFE, add the stage increase associated with the flood fringe or the floodway. So that's that maximum of 1/2 foot. And then add an additional 1 foot minimum of freeboard. And if you add all of those together, that will give you your minimum lowest floor elevation or your RFPE. And that's been the case since 1997 here in Minnesota. Do note that some communities may have more strict requirements, so be aware of that. That would just be the state minimum. This is showing kind of that same information, but in cross-sectional form. So we have a new development shown here. It's this new building with some fill that's been added to the floodplain. There's a couple good things to note here. Firstly, this building is being constructed in the flood fringe. As we saw on the previous slide, it would not be allowed to be constructed in the floodway. There are these 3 kind of dashed horizontal lines. The lowest one is the ordinary high water level. This one here in the middle is the one that's relevant for our RFPE calculation. This is the base flood elevation, including the stage increase associated with the floodway. And then above that, with at least 1 foot of freeboard, is our RFPE, or our lowest floor elevation. So that building cannot be constructed below that elevation. As the floodplain changes due to this fill, the floodplain boundary will move a little bit as well. And we'll note that you need to have at least a 15-foot setback between a new residential structure and the new boundary of that floodplain. So many of our Zone A floodplains in the state do have models associated with them. So those are known as model-backed A zones. And we show on the Lake and Flood Elevations online website, or LFEO, which you can get to through the DNR website. We have what are known as pink lines, and these are showing the estimated 1% water surface elevations based on those models that are associated with the A zone. While they're not official BFEs, they can be used as the best available data for BFEs. So if we wanted to construct a new building here near this 1,000-foot elevation line, we could perform our RFPE calculation. So for this Zone A area, no floodway has been determined. So we can just assume that the stage increase for the floodway would be that 1/2 foot maximum. And then we could add an additional 1 foot of freeboard. And we could say that if a new building was to be constructed here, it would need to be at least 1001.5 to account for those increases for the lowest floor elevation. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the available data that we have and some updates to our map status. So highly recommend that you go to this Find Flood Maps site on the DNR website. We do have a link in the slides as well. And that'll take you to this map, kind of letting you know what data is available and where. So these blue counties are all counties that have a DFIRM available. Green counties are still paper maps. We do have a few counties that are currently unmapped. Anywhere where you see these pink lines, those are the pink lines that if you were to zoom in, you could review the elevations for these A zones through that LFEO site. Just some updates to things that have happened in the last year or so. We have added 2 new DFIRMs. We've got some preliminary DFIRMs available as well for several counties, and some countywide modernization efforts have been completed as well. This is showing 9 of the watersheds where we've recently completed discovery projects. We do have an additional 3 discovery projects ongoing in Becker County, Polk County, and Wadena County. And there is a FEMA contractor who is completing some 2D base level engineering in the Lake Superior area in the northeast corner of the state. We are also currently updating the floodplain maps for the Twin Cities Huck 8 watershed, which is shown in this pink outline here. And then we are also doing the remainder of Anoka outside that Huck 8 watershed. We have some current and recent preliminary map projects as well. So in Aitkin, Chippewa, Murray County, and Rock County. We do occasionally work with FEMA to update some mapping. So we do some letters of map revision using the better available data. We have 2 of those projects undergoing in Koochiching County with the Rainy River, and also the Cedar River watershed in Dodge County. We also have this really handy table that shows the most up-to-date mapping available, including dates for when newer maps might become available. I think this is updated every month or so, but there will be a link to that in the slides as well. And I think Ceil takes over at this point.
I do. Thanks, Doug. Okay, so Doug's gone over some nice basics there about what the A zones are. And as he mentioned, they don't have the flood elevations on the FEMA maps, but we do have some other sources. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those other sources for getting best available data. And one of the big ones we'll talk about is our Lake and Flood Elevations Online site, or LFEO. There's some county data viewers. Our shoreland method in Minnesota is used a lot. We'll talk a little bit about using past letters of map amendments that FEMA have issued, and just other locally available data that a watershed or community might have. And then if none of those are available, then reaching out to DNR staff to get some assistance. So Doug was talking about the LFEO viewer, and this is an example here of, if you go into the layers, you'll see one of them is this estimated 1% water surface elevation. We don't call it a BFE because it's not officially a BFE, but we can use it as our best available data and use it like it's a BFE. And we purposely are using some symbology that's similar to what's on the FEMA maps. We actually created a separate layer and update as FEMA updates their maps. We were originally going to tie right to the FEMA layers, but they are often broken or really slow. So we did this, our own layer, so that we can have a more responsive site. So if your site was here, you could either take the upstream cross-section, that will always be the most stringent for coming up with that base flood elevation, or if there's a big drop, you can do some prorating, but you'll always look at what's the upstream point of the building that you're looking at, or the footprint of the proposed building that you're looking at. We do have parts of the state, as Doug mentioned, that still have the paper maps. If we have paper maps, most of the counties that have paper maps, we have an unofficial layer that shows the floodplain, and still could be very helpful. And in counties where we've got preliminary information, we often have these pink lines available. If they've gone through some of that map modernization effort, we'll have the cross sections available here to use as our best available BFEs. If you want to get those pink lines, you can download them at MinGeo, and that's something DNR staff can talk to your GIS folks directly. Many of the counties have grabbed those layers, and we've had the viewers since 2021 with those pink lines in there. We mentioned that there are some counties where there's some additional map viewers available. A few of the counties have some really nice interactive information, like Anoka and Hennepin. But we also will note on this page if there's some preliminary new maps that they can get, or if there's a work map, a draft map. So one example would be in Winona County. They don't have an official prelim map yet, but they do have a draft working map that they have made available to us, and communities there can be using that. So it shows the proposed elevations here, and there is another place where you can turn on the current, basically those unmodernized layers. And they do, it's going to vary by county, but in this case, they do have the layers. You can turn on the aerial photo background. You can make it a little bit more transparent here, so you can look at where buildings are relative to that updated data. Again, this is not the official FEMA maps, but because they're A zones, we can use the best available data that we have. And this, when it's available in a viewer like this, or it's available as the pink lines on LFEO site, That's our best available data. The next method we're going to talk about is the shoreland method. In Minnesota, we have lots of lakes, and we do also have shoreland management regulations. And in our shoreland management regulations, we have minimum elevations. If you're in the floodplain, of course, you're following the floodplain regulations. But if you're in the shoreland district, we've also got minimum elevations. And it basically says that if you have the flood elevation, you have the regulatory flood protection elevation calculated, that's what you're using for your minimum elevation for that building. Here's the base flood elevation. Here's the regulatory flood protection elevation showing that foot of freeboard. If you don't have that flood elevation, we're going to take the ordinary high or highest known water level, whichever's higher, and that is readily available, or you can, if we don't have an ordinary high established, you'll reach out to your area hydrologist to get at least an estimate, or if an official one's needed, they'll work with our surveyors to get that calculated. But you use that ordinary high or highest known, whichever's higher, and we add 3 feet. And that is our lowest floor requirement. So that being consistent with the floodplain calculations, that includes a foot of freeboard. So we say that the base flood elevation estimate is 2 feet above the ordinary high or the highest known water level. And this is something that we show in our quick guide, which Doug mentioned earlier. On page 19 of that, we show that same concept, that there's the 3 feet above the ordinary high or highest known water level, and a foot of that is going to be that freeboard. So the BFE is estimated 2 feet above the ordinary high or highest known. We did just recently update our info sheet talking about this method. So if these few slides are whizzing by a little too quickly, can take a look at this info sheet for a little bit more detail on using that method. And I will say that FEMA accepts this method for best available data unless we have other better data, that FEMA will accept our shoreland method for estimating base flood elevations. And this is just zooming in on the graphic that's in our info sheet showing that same concept. We've got our foot of freeboard, so 2 feet above is going to be our base flood elevation estimate. So just be aware that Lake Finder, which many of you are aware of, that's the site where you can go and see when there's been an ordinary high determined. You can see the history of water levels. The look of that's changed recently. So when you select a basin, you'll see this kind of a page. To get to the water levels, you're going to need to go to this spot in the lake report section. And if you go to the water levels page, you'll see the page that you're used to seeing there. It'll show history of water levels. You will enlarge they're looking at this a little closer. Here's the ordinary high, here's the period of record and all those kinds of things. It will show, you do have a place where you can download the data basically as into an Excel file, but for the normal person looking at this site, that's not that easy to do. We do have a little graph showing just the last 10 years of data. We're hoping to get a more interactive map that shows the entire record in the future. In Alfeo on the lakes, if the lake has this dark blue color, like this, then if you click on the lake, you're going to get this box here. Sometimes it won't show the information in the box right away. You might need to go to page 2 of 2, like in this example here. If you want to move it over to the side, you don't want that box covering the lake. We've got this little docking thing here. But when you go into that box, that pop-out box, if we have the 100-year, we'll show it here. We do note what elevation datum that is in. If we have the 10-year, 50-year, 500-year will show that, and will show what the source was. In this example, we had our staff do a statistical study because we had a lot of records over the years. And you will probably need to scroll to see some of this information. The other situations to be aware of is in LFIO, those that have this kind of lightish blue color we won't have the flood elevations in there, but if you click on there, you'll see the ordinary high and the highest recorded information here. So again, that means that you might have some data to look at using the shoreland method of coming up with your base flood elevation. And just zooming in here so you can see it a little bit better. We do have the warning here about the datum because, well, most of the DNR records on water levels and ordinary highs are in 29 datum, the NGVD 29 datum, whereas most of our mapping, if they've got a digital flood insurance rate map, the newer maps, that in most cases is going to be in the NAVD 88 datum. So again, that's kind of a reference to like Celsius versus Fahrenheit. We're not changing the number per se, but we have a different reference point, and it can be range from 0 to a 1.4 foot difference in Minnesota. So it's really important to know the datums in the data you're looking at and what is in the on the FEMA maps where they've got the detailed studies will use the 88 in most cases, other than in Hennepin County, they're still using 29. Another source of information would be FEMA has this process where if people think that their building is actually higher, they can apply to FEMA and show better data and say, my better data here shows that the building is actually above the flood elevation, and the accuracy of your FEMA map just wasn't good enough to show I'm really not in the high risk area. And since people who have a building in the high risk area or touching that high risk area, if they've got a federally backed loan, that lender's going to tell them that they must get flood insurance. That's a federal requirement, that they must require flood insurance if it's a federally backed loan of any type and the building is in or touching that high risk area. So a lot of people will say, well, I'm really high. I don't want to have the mandatory flood insurance, and so I'm going to apply to FEMA for this letter of map amendment. Or they may have put in fill and followed your local ordinance and properly elevated the building, and they might be getting a letter of map revision based on fill. So you can use those old LOMAs and get an idea of what the base flood elevation is that the FEMA reviewers used to determine if that building was above the base flood elevation. If you go to the FEMA National Flood Hazard layer, you're going to have to turn on the LOMA layer. You'll go into the National Flood Hazard layer, the layer, and expand that and turn on the LOMA layer. You can see the LOMAs and the LOMA Fs, both for the paper map and the digital counties. And so here we've got all these little purple dots. They show the effective date. They show the case number. Let's go and look at an example here. If you're in the National Flood Hazard layer and you zoom in and you click on that purple dot, it will show this pop-out box. So it will show the address there or the legal description. And it's got this download letter here. If you click on that, you'll get the determination letter. So it'll have the case number. In this case, it's a LOMA. This is an older one. So if we look at the information in this area of the determination document, it'll show the base flood elevation that they use, the 1% annual chance flood elevation they use. Before about 2013, they actually would put it on the document. So if you happen to see an older one, you've got some helpful information there. On the newer ones and the older ones, they will show the lowest adjacent grade. So if you look and see a LOMA in the area you're interested in, and it shows a lowest adjacent grade, and your building is above what they gave the lowest adjacent grade, where they were successfully able to get that LOMA, then you know that you'll be able to use that LOMA to help support getting an estimate of your base flood elevation. DNR staff can access the application forms and some of the behind the scene information for these LOMAs. And so we'll do that when we see that there's a LOMA case and they don't show the BFE on there. We'll look at the LOMA case and see if we can figure out what the FEMA staff used as a LOMA, and we can provide that information to the local government or the surveyor or whoever it is that's looking for that estimate. And then just another option to be aware of is, let's say you've got a site and we don't have our pink lines, we don't have our supporting A-zone models. It's not a lake where it makes sense to use our shoreland method. There's no LOMAs in the area that are helpful. You've checked with the DNR, and we've looked at bridge information in the area and other data in the area, and we can't find anything. You can request that FEMA, you can apply to FEMA for a LOMA and say in the application, hey, I've checked with DNR and my community and my watershed, and we don't have information. Please determine my base flood elevation for me. So that is one way that if it's an individual property, that you can get that information. Mentioned earlier that some of the other sources would be certainly reaching out to your community. They might have a nice citywide stormwater management plan. Many of, especially our metro cities, will have that, and the bigger cities. Otherwise contact your area hydrologists and floodplain staff for more help. And watershed districts also often have some good information, and that's one of the first places we'll be checking if we're seeing if there's information in the area. But reach out to the DNR staff and we'll see if there's bridge information immediately upstream or downstream, that we've got some hydraulic data. And in a worst case, we'll look at contour interpolation or other sources and come up with an estimate, but those are going to be on the conservative side. So let's say you've come up with an estimate for a homeowner and they don't like that estimate. They think it's too high. Do they have to accept that determination, or can they hire an engineer or surveyor to determine an estimated BFE for them? That is fiction. That you're helping them out. We're helping them out if we're trying to come up with a best available data BFE, but they can choose to have an engineer do a more detailed study. They're going to have to pay for that, but they can do that if we don't have better data. A little bit here about floodway versus flood fringe. There are going to be places where there's detailed study, but they don't have the floodway shown. And we will treat that as floodway until we know otherwise, until we've determined that it's actually flood fringe. And in our model ordinance, we talk about that in the general floodplain section. The general floodplain is basically the zone A's or the zone AE where we haven't got the floodway determined. So back here to our section 7, our general floodplain district, we basically say if you haven't calculated where the floodway versus flood fringe is, you're going to only allow things that are allowed in the floodway district. We're going to treat the whole area as floodway. And if you don't want to treat it all as floodway, you have to determine which part is floodway versus flood fringe. And once you've done that, you go to the floodway section of your ordinance or the flood fringe section of your ordinance. And again, option 1, just treat everything as floodway. No buildings are allowed, no new buildings are allowed in there. You have to determine, you have to look at whether allowable rise is being met if they're putting in a new roadway or culverts or doing grading in the floodway. Or you get better data. You determine that BFE, which is mandatory to have a more detailed study according to federal law. If it's 5 acres or 50 lots, whichever's less, you must use that best. Otherwise, you're using best available data. And we'll talk about a few methods in addition to an engineering model to look at whether it's floodway versus flood fringe. So here is what that looks like. You've got the A zone. If it's above the base flood elevation, then it's not in the floodway. But otherwise, you can't be allowing structures in unless you're determining it's floodway or flood fringe. Now, in this case, if they were nicking this little area, that's not an effective flow area. We could discuss that with the local officials, get DNR input, and agree that maybe the very edge of this is not the effective flow area, and you could treat that as flood fringe. So here's an example where we're looking at, we've got the contours here, and we can see that that site is actually above our best available data for the base flood elevation. So in that case, we could say that would be flood fringe. And this is an example of one of the older maps where the floodplain boundary does not follow the LIDAR very well compared to the flood elevations. So especially in some of these areas where the mapping boundary is poor, where this will be a situation where we're often looking at, is it even below the base flood elevation? And again, if it's above, we know it's can be treated as flood fringe. So again, procedures for determining floodway. If it's that bigger development, you must do the detailed study per the federal code. You can hire an engineer to do modeling and delineate where that floodway versus flood fringe is, or we'll have some acceptable alternative methods we'll cover a little bit later here today.
Yeah, so this slide is kind of relating to what Ceil was just talking about. So if you have a new development with 50 lots or greater than 5 acres, you will need to have a PE determine an actual floodway if one does not exist. To do that, they would need to obtain the existing A zone model. If there is no model for the area, they'd need to create a new one. They would need to model that floodway. We're not going to go into the details of that today, but it's certainly something that we can help with if needed. They would also need to verify the maximum stage increase is no more than that half a foot. And again, the important caveat, they also need to verify that there is no increase in flood damage potential to any insurable structures. And along with that effort, there's some documentation that must be prepared. They need to show the floodway location on a map. Whether or not the floodway makes it onto the official map, they do need to at least demonstrate where that floodway is located. They need to include verification proving that the rise is allowable, and then both locally and at the DNR, records need to be kept for that. So you would need to keep those locally. So going back to our model-backed zone A's, if you're in the LFEO site and you see these pink lines, it's very likely that there is a model associated with this zone A floodplain. But there are times when the map may show things that don't make a whole lot of sense. Like the example Ceil showed, the floodplain may not be following the contours very well or at all. As in this example, there may be a large drop across a roadway crossing. This example shows a 7-foot drop across the road, which is quite high, and so it might be worth investigating. So as we've said a few times, these A-zone studies are approximate. Oftentimes the models are missing some details, and in some cases they may be missing a lot of detail. So this is an example cross-section from an A-zone model. If you know anything about a natural meandering stream, this is just not what a stream cross-section would typically look like. So it's highly likely that this is based on some pretty approximate dimensions. It's really missing quite a bit of detail here. Similarly, sometimes you'll see cross sections that were likely created just using the available LiDAR, which is very common, but LiDAR is not able to penetrate the water surface, so it may actually be missing some of the deepest parts of the channel, which can be very important for conveyance. So you can kind of see the difference between this cross section versus this one here that does have that channel pretty well defined. So oftentimes adjusting these cross sections to include better data can improve the model results dramatically and have a pretty big impact on the mapping. So this is that same example from before, kind of highlighting that large drop across the crossing here. Say that we've got a homeowner who's on the upstream side of this crossing who doesn't believe that they are at as much flood risk as the mapping is showing. There are a lot of things that can be done to determine whether the drop is realistic or if this map is maybe a bit inaccurate here. So you can go into a model and update the cross sections to include the actual capacity of the channel. So you can account for those deeper areas that may be missed by LiDAR. You can also review and update culverts or bridges in the model. Oftentimes they may not be modeled correctly, and in some cases they're not modeled at all. So it's not uncommon for a culvert to be the wrong size because, when this approximate study was being developed, they were just using an aerial and measuring the culvert that way, and they may have missed some important detail. So if you want to download these model-backed A-zone models, the ones with the pink lines, we do have a link to the model download site here where those models can be obtained. So yeah, an engineer can download the model from the download site, revisions can be made, and maps can be updated that way. So this is a little screen grab showing the landing page for that hydraulic model download site. There is a big button here in the center where you can launch the application. We do have a link to that here. Once you enter that application, you'll see a map of the state of Minnesota showing a number of reaches. We've got blue reaches, which is a little less than half of the state. That indicates that there is a model that can be downloaded associated with that reach. So if you were to zoom in and click on it, you could download a model. These gray reaches indicate that there is no model on this site. In many cases, it's just because the model has not been uploaded yet. We may still have a model for that area, though in some cases there will be no available model. So you can always contact us if you're in one of these gray reaches to see if we do in fact have a model that you can use. So still in that site, if you were to zoom in on one of these blue reaches where we have a model, you could click on the model and it'll pull up this little window with a lot of helpful information. You can see what the stream is named, where it's located, what type of flood zone it is, the effective model date, the model software that was used, and some other helpful information such as who created the model and how it was mapped. In some cases, you'll find a reach that has multiple models associated with it. So sometimes there are historic, older models there, which can be very helpful for understanding how an area was mapped in the first place. But generally, you'll want to use the most recent model, as that would be the effective model. So as Ceil kind of mentioned, there are some cases where you don't need to perform a full H&H analysis to determine whether something is in the floodway or the flood fringe. And in those cases, you can use other standard engineering practices. So we'll talk about a few of those now. So one example is if you have a situation where a site is clearly backwater that does not have any velocity or flows and it's just storage. In those cases, you can say, yes, this is definitely the flood fringe. It is not the floodway. Upstream or downstream of a bridge contraction or expansion zone, you can also find areas that we can say are definitely flood fringe. And then on lakes or other basins, you can treat areas above the ordinary high water level as the flood fringe. Do note that you should consult with the DNR and review the community's ordinance for those specific areas as well. And really in all of these cases, please consult with the DNR or a PE when making this determination. Okay, so this is an example of the backwater area situation. So this kind of orangish, brownish color here, that is the floodplain boundary. If we have a proposed site here on this little kind of lobe of the floodplain, we know that water only has one way into this storage area and one way out. There's clearly no positive flow in the direction of the channel. So in this case, we can say, yes, this is definitely backwater. There's no flow that's occurring here. It's the flood fringe, not the floodway. So here's an example where we have a floodplain in blue here that's clearly not following the contours very well. So it's a little bit hard to rely on this map to say for sure that this proposed structure here is outside the floodplain or is in the flood fringe. But we do have some helpful information that we can use. So we do have these pink lines here, so the best available data. If we assume that elevation, closest elevation is 1047.6, we can look at the map and see that there is this 1048 contour running through here. This proposed structure is above that 1048 contour. It's definitely out of the floodplain. So a structure could be constructed here, but do note that it would still need to meet that RFPE, minimum lowest floor elevation. A slightly trickier example here is if that proposed structure was moved somewhat to the east, well, suddenly part of this structure is now below that 1048 contour. So it's not immediately obvious whether or not this would be in the floodplain or if it would be in the flood fringe or floodway. So we can use, again, this 1047.6 elevation. We know that we've got above 1048 up here. We know that there's no positive flow moving this direction. If this area were in fact to fill up to the elevation of this structure, this area kind of behind this line connecting the 1048 contour would be considered backwater. So we could say that, yes, this is definitely flood fringe. So this is an example where we have a floodplain that's being bisected by a roadway and a bridge crossing. So for water to pass through this relatively narrow opening, it needs to contract on the upstream side and then expand on the downstream side. And so these areas that are in kind of the tannish colors here, those are outside those contraction and expansion zones, and there's very little flow velocity happening here. This is mostly just storage. We would call this ineffective flow area, and we would say that this is the flood fringe, and we would not need to do any more analysis than that. But do note that this is only true if all of the water is passing through the narrow opening. If the 1% flood in fact goes over the road, we could no longer say that this is ineffective flow area because it's not meeting that contraction requirement. So this is a similar example, just to put some numbers to it. If we have a proposed site on the upstream side of this crossing and all of the water is being forced through this bridge opening here, we can use a ratio of 1:1 to determine that contraction ratio. And if it's outside that 1:1 ratio, we can say that, yes, this is storage, this is flood fringe, it is outside the floodway. On the downstream side, we can do a similar analysis. Because water expands more slowly than it contracts, we actually use a less strict contraction ratio or expansion ratio here. So 2:1 or 3:1 can be used instead. And then we can show that, yes, this proposed site number 2 is outside of that ratio. So again, this is flood fringe. And Ceil, I think you jump back in here.
But for the lakes, as mentioned before, in general, areas above the ordinary high can be considered flood fringe, and we have some optional wording in our sample ordinance. So if you've got that wording in your ordinance, you can say that the area above the ordinary high is flood fringe, below the ordinary high is floodway, as long as it's not a flowing situation. So that part there where the lake is actually part of a river system, you don't get to use that method. That you got to treat that more like a riverine area. On the lakes, most of that lake can be considered above the ordinary highs flood fringe, but near the inlets and outlet areas, you're going to have narrowing, the water going into those tributaries or going out the outlet. You'll have flows in those areas. So there you need to use other methods. And we do, again, have that information in the model ordinance, and it basically talks about those, what we just showed in the previous slide, but the intent is to make it more flexible for local governments to administer the regulations. And again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to the DNR, especially if it's near an inlet or an outlet there.
Ceil, my understanding is FEMA has accepted that methodology. Is that correct?
They have been. So, and then talking about just a few other frequencies that we have. When there are detailed studies, traditionally the calculations that have been done for the 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, 500-year, of course the 100 years are regulatory, but we get that other data. More recent updates, they've also included the 25-year and something called the 100-year plus, which we won't get into here, but be aware that even in A zones, we're getting those other frequencies. This map shows some of the counties where we have that A zone information available and have many of those other frequencies. So you can be getting that data. We have that as a layer and can provide it to your GIS folks. We're hoping to get that onto Alfeo in the future. So here's an example in Morrison. If you're using GIS, you have that layer, you click on that cross section, you're going to see that data. And so in this example, I'm looking for the 10-year because they're looking at an on-site septic system in the area. And if you know the 10-year, you have to keep areas of that system above the 10-year. So here we've got that great data available now. And just ending with a list of some of the resources. We've talked about some of these, and again, in the PDFs of the slides that we'll send out, you'll have a link here. But the FEMA Map Service Center, you can get copies of historic maps and older LOMERs and LOMAs and LOMER-Fs, and you can print an official format. The flood map changes viewer is great for seeing those preliminary and pending maps. Our MinTopo site is great for elevation information, and we've been talking a lot about our Alfeo site. And we did have some clips from our quick guide. That's a link to the latest version we have was from 2022. And you know it's the latest because it's got that picture of the nice picture on the cover there that you can see. So thanks everyone for attending. Appreciate you coming, and hopefully you learned some things.